you're looking for tips on how to dominate your fantasy draft, we're here today to go over draft strategy and different ways you can attack your Superflex draft to get the best team possible. Matt, how's it going?
I'm doing good, my friend. Excited for this one.
If you like the video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to hear more from us, hit that subscribe button and let's get into it. So the first topic that we want to go over that might be the most critical is to make sure that you know your league settings. And as cliche or as obvious as this sounds, that can make a huge difference in terms of how you want to approach your draft. Make sure you know how many teams are going to be 8, 10, and 12. I've definitely heard some leagues that have changed between like 8 to 10, like a week before the draft, that type of thing. So make sure you're talking to the group and make sure you have that number locked in. Your scoring format, obviously a huge thing between standard, half point PPR and full point PPR. That can wildly change the values of a lot of different players, including some of the top end players, right? Good example there is Devon Achane going into this year, much more valuable in a PPR league than he is in a standard league. Same thing with Derrick Henry, much more valuable in a standard league than he is in a PPR league. So just make sure that you understand your draft rules there. And then also how many starters you have, how many bench spots you have, how many IR spots you have. Right. You don't want to go into a draft where you're thinking you only need to play 2 wide receivers and a flex. And then all of a sudden there's 3 wide receivers and multiple flex players, because that can change how you would attack the wide receiver position, for example.
Yeah, and for the quarterbacks specifically, so if you're in a standard scoring league, QBs should get a big bump, and dependent as well on how many roster spots there are. So if you're in 3 wide receiver, like maybe 2 flex spots, then the value of the QBs would drop just a little bit, but especially in PPR. So to give you an example from last year, in full PPR, Jamar Chase finished as the number 2 overall scorer, sandwiched between Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen. But in standard, he finished as the number 19 player in fantasy between Purdy and Rodgers, and 11 spots behind Saquon. And he was also behind Gibbs in Bijan. And half PPR, I think he finished overall as number 6. So just to kind of showcase, how much of a difference that can make, as well as, 3 wide receiver is what we play, and we definitely preach that. But 2 wide receiver, 2 flex is also gaining some popularity as well. So I typically go into those drafts being in the mindset kind of similar to 3 wide receiver is where I want to start 4 wide receivers, especially in full PPR, but don't necessarily pigeonhole yourself. And then the last point to add with the IR spots. So assuming you have a couple IR spots, don't overdraft players for IR spots specifically. So last year we saw Jonathan Brooks get pushed up. Unless you got bailed out by drafting Chuba, that was definitely a mistake. Someone who comes to mind is Brandon Ayuk. This year, maybe Joe Mixon now. And the caveat being, like, if those guys free fall in drafts and you're already locked in at those positions, then that's when I'd be more inclined to take them. But don't, push those guys up too much, because if they're coming off injury, there was a reason that they're out and they might not even be back fully healthy.
Yeah, and Mixon is a great call out because we just got news that he's still dealing with his foot injury, and he was already in that 15 to 20 range. And I do think that we're going to see him fall outside of the top 10 rounds at this point. And so maybe there's a buying opportunity on a different running back in that backfield, but that's going to be a situation that we have to follow. That falls perfectly into as an example. So with analyzing previous drafts, this is what we talk about when we say you have to know your league, right? And the more drafts you've done with the players in your league, the more information that you'll have about how they're possibly thinking going into the draft. Obviously, things can change slightly, but for the most part, you can kind of predict where you think like wide receiver 12 is going to go, maybe 12 to 14, that type of thing. But year over year, there's rarely a big change, right? So for Superflex, right, there's a QB strategy where you know where those first guys go. And so maybe it's 1, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 4 in the first round. But then like the guys that are more important to know about is like when quarterback 12 starts to go out, when quarterback 18 starts to go off. So if you can wait until round 6 or round 7 or round 9 in your Superflex leagues, especially if you have 3 wide receivers, to lock in that second quarterback. So if you go in round 1 with Daniels, we always talk about waiting because it just feels like this year, again, you can get somebody really good late, like Tua in round 9, for example, for me. And maybe not for you, but maybe a Trevor Lawrence ends up down in round 8. And you like him, not for me, but maybe for you. There's a lot of merit to knowing when those quarterbacks are going to go. And honestly, it applies to running backs and wide receivers as well.
And I think an important call out as well is if you've been in this league for a number of years and you're just now switching to Superflex for the first time, look at where quarterbacks historically go. For example, like if your league is, they're drafting Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen in the second round of standard, then you can very well anticipate a lot of quarterbacks going early. If this is your first year playing Superflex, expect more quarterbacks to go early, because when you're pulling up Superflex rankings, you're going to see a laundry list of QBs before a lot of the top players go. So I would expect people to kind of follow that more as they get their footing underneath them. And then I will say too, with like the draft board, it's fun too, right? Looking back at previous years, talking trash to your buddies. We're going to be out in Palm Springs for our draft next month, and it'll be fun to throw up last year's draft board on the TV, the night before we draft, and kind of talk smack to each other. So definitely something that's underutilized and not talked about enough.
And to highlight something you said too, going over the draft boards is always so fun. You get the guy in your league that thinks he drafted like the best team and they got hit with injuries, and then you go back and see maybe he didn't have necessarily the best roster, as good of a roster as he thought he did. And so that's kind of fun too, where it's like, oh, maybe you did draft a little bit better team or a little bit injury averse, drafting Debo maybe isn't the safest pick from an injury perspective, so no, that's always really fun. Or like, guys that get wildly overdrafted. I know we had a year where Najee Harris went before Devon Achane. That was last year, I think, too. So, it's just like kind of fun to see what happened and how it transpires every year, and there's always going to be picks like that, or, even hitting on guys that you had as deep sleepers, that ended up being major difference makers. I know Joe Mixon went in round 7 in our league last year, and so there's guys like that every year that end up popping. Going over it, analyzing it, getting the group chat going. That's always a positive for your fantasy league. So going down to the third point here, right, is curating your own rankings and tiers. And that's a huge one, because this one will help you identify players that stand out as major values when you're on the clock. So if you already have your tiers set up and you're crossing out names as you're going through the draft, and you have 3 quarterbacks in your next tier, 1 running back in your next tier that's left, and then like 3 or 4 wide receivers, right, that running back just stands out as the player that you should be taking to maximize your value, and then try and grab one of the quarterbacks or one of the receivers at your next pick that are available, that are all in the same tier. So, right, you want to know your site and know the rankings and know where guys could possibly fall, and then make sure you compare that against how you have your players ranked and or tiered. And that can be as simple too as just, printing out a list from ESPN or whatever. They have that single page list and marking the players that you like, right? And as you go through the list, as those guys kind of dwindle down, or putting brackets around where you kind of have them tiered, or cross out guys that you don't necessarily want, that type of thing, right? Just do a little bit of prep and a little bit of thinking about how you like the players and how you would rank the players to help you prep. It's a huge, huge help to have looked at that beforehand.
And I think to call out a couple tiers in this upcoming draft, I would say for me, my mindset is I don't want to leave any draft without a top 11 wide receiver. And that's the tier that cuts off with the Drake London, AJ Brown, Loud McConkey tier, because we've talked about this at length, where, the number 12 wide receiver is kind of in flux, and maybe that settles in. But for me, that's just something I'm going to be targeting heavily. And then at the quarterback position, whether or not you view it as like a big 3 or a big 5, if you want to include, Burrow and Hurts, but between QB6, who's Patrick Mahomes, and Jordan Love, who is like QB 17 on Fantasy Pros, it's like there's a lot of players in that tier that you can make a strong case for. So if you miss out on the top guys, I think it makes sense to wait in a lot of cases. And it's like, just to talk about Jordan Love specifically, it's like, yeah, he was injured last year. The team turned, very run heavy, but the year prior, he was QB5, and now they add a first-round wide receiver. And more importantly, I just don't think that their defense is going to be good enough to run the ball as much as they may want to. So just make sure you're all over those tiers. And then with, the site platforms, I remember doing a PPR draft on ESPN last year, and they had Achane like solo. Like I forget where they had him, but it was egregious, right? And obviously that ended up looking like a fantastic pick. We know what happened with Tua and how the offense sank, but just make sure there's, your platform that you're heading into, and if there's anything that totally stands out.
Yeah. And somebody else too that we could possibly highlight at the running back position, right? We talk about hero running back, and it's like, well, I very much prefer to get one of the top 3 if you're going to go in on a running back, but then after that, it's like, there's like down to 11, and then it gets a little bit rougher, but like if you miss on the top three, I just feel like getting an absolute difference maker at the position is really difficult to find, and so maybe you still include Henry in there, and you include HN, you include maybe Genty, McCaffrey maybe, but like I don't know, if I would love to get somebody that it's a very solid and safe from, or safer. I feel safer about his injury history, so that's definitely something where you should be thinking about those things and making your pick decisions based on how you feel about the position as you go along in the draft. All right, and then the last thing that we want to talk about is filling out your bench with a purpose. And this is a huge deal because I feel like sometimes people just go like all upside, or they go all safety, or they're picking extra defenses, or they pick an extra tight end or an extra kicker, and it's like, or they go in, they have two really good running backs and they pick both handcuffs, and it's like, dude, like you got to be a little smarter with your bench spots. You got to remember that each one of those is a lotto ticket on trying to hit on the next, breakout player that goes late in drafts. And the more you take, handcuff running backs, the more you take extra tight ends, the more you take an extra defense, the less chance you have to hit on any of those players. So I can't stress enough that you want to have at least a little bit of level of safety. You want to have guys you're confident in. So like if David Montgomery is like your first bench player, that's a guy that for me, that's like safety with a little bit of upside, but pretty much just like a safe player, you're going to get, or like a Jacoby Myers, who we both love, get him in round 9 or 10, and he's your first bench player. It's pretty safe wide receiver 3 or 4. And then you can take shots on guys like Darnell Mooney or Keon Coleman or, Jaden Reed, like that have these big upsides, but could also be like hard to start week to week because they're kind of boom busts. So you don't want to get all of one type of player, and you definitely don't want to get, second tight end, kicker, a defense that just prevents you from being able to take shots at running back and wide receiver.
Yeah, and I would say too, like look at the way that you built out your team. So if you went robust running back and you're just loaded at the top 3 at the position, like don't draft Najee or Ramondre or one of these guys that might have bigger first half roles than second half roles. Like just be smart about that. And on the wide receiver side, like if you are thin at wide receiver, you don't attack that, early and often. Don't draft Rashee Rice knowing that he's probably going to be suspended for 4 weeks. So just be very cognizant about all of that. And I will say with like the no second tight end thing, the only time I would consider that is just know how many bench spots you have, because if you're in like a 4 bench league, like you can't necessarily do that. But if you have 6 bench, and let's say you waited all the way till the end and you take Dallas Goedert, right? Like he's a good player on a good offense, struggles with injuries, and then you want to take like a Colston Loveland with your last round pick, who maybe will take some time to develop, but has a lot of upside and a lot of draft capital on what should be an improved offense. So just be smart about that. Like if you take Trey McBride, like you don't need to take Dallas Goedert at the end of your draft.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
just be very very cognizant about that.
Yeah, and my thought on the tight end even too is, I know you say like going on Loveland with Goddard, like I would just take a shot on whoever you want at tight end, and then the first couple of weeks, like the very first player that was a big waiver spend was Isaiah Likely, like a tight end from week 1, right? And so I would almost rather go into the season with just one and then try and play that waiver wire game. Because if somebody else drafts, say Loveland or whatever, there's going to be another tight end, right? You go on throughout the season, and even Jonnu is somebody that you would have rather had than any tight end that kind of came on in week 7 or 8. So, if you wait in your draft and you don't hit, I'd almost rather just know going into the season that you're going to be playing the tight end roulette game.
Yeah, and then with handcuffs too, I'm kind of in the middle when it comes to handcuffs. There's a handful or a small handful of guys that, we already know if they become the starters are going to be very productive, right? So with Kenneth Walker, like, okay, if you want to draft Zach Charbonnet, I totally understand that because we've seen what he can do in that role. Same thing with Christian McCaffrey. We know he has a ton of health concerns. So take Isaac Guerrero. But a lot of these other guys that are unproven, where it's like, okay, maybe Jonathan Taylor misses time, and like I like DJ Giddens as a prospect, but like I don't know if he's going to like be thrust into that workforce role. And we saw that last year with James Conner and Trey Benson. It's like,
Yep.
okay, like Benson has a nice prospect profile, but like he hasn't done it yet, and he didn't really do much with his opportunities. So don't think like you just have to take their backup to be safe, because what's going to end up happening, and I made this huge mistake in a league last year where I had drafted James Conner and I took Trey Benson, and what did I do after week 2? After 2
Cut
stinkers
Hubbard.
of performances, I cut Chuba Hubbard, right? And so that's a big lesson learned, and something that I'm embarrassed to say, but I just want to drive home the point.
It highlights my point on handcuffs. Don't get married to a handcuff, right? In your mind, like you have to have them. You have Fab for that reason, right? Make sure you change your waiver systems to Fab, so that if James Conner does get hurt, you can spend 50 or 60% on getting Benson if that's what you want to do, right? Like you want to go get your guy to replace. But look at what would have happened. You would have just had Chuba Hubbard, right? And so it's like, I don't know. My point being is Chuba is one of the guys that you spent a lottery ticket on that ended up hitting. And, the longer you can hang on to that guy to the bye weeks, I would say usually week 5, you want to try and hang on to your guys, see what you have in the first month of the season. And, things can change significantly even in that amount of time. Look at what happened with Carolina, right? I mean, they changed to Andy Dalton. The offense got going. They went back to Bryce Young, who was much better the second half of the year. So, it's just a point to highlight. I know I do it sometimes too. I mean, I would have probably advised you to keep Benson because that Connor Benson pairing felt like you would have an RB2. But the thing was, is Connor just never ended up getting hurt. So, he had pretty consistently missed time and he just didn't. So, and then Benson, I mean, he got a chance one game, I think, and it wasn't even that inspiring. Didn't have a lot of passing game work either. So that's another thing I would look at in terms of the skill set of handcuffs is if they're not pass catchers, then it's even more difficult to project their workload because what are they going to be, 18 carries? Is that really that different than Najee Harris? So yeah, anyways, I think we made our point there. And so hopefully this helps with your drafts. Hopefully it helps with your preparation. Hopefully it helps when you're on the clock. Think about some of these things and make sure that you're getting the right players on your team to be successful. And with that, thank you so much for listening.